Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, a guide to incident response framework, business email compromise. And I am Ritika Chakraborty. I will be your host for the day. Before we get started, we would like to go over a few house rules. For our attendees, the session will be in listen only mode and will last for an hour, out of which last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to the organizer or our speaker, use the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio video challenges, please check your internet connection or you may log out or log in again. Just a reminder to all our audience that this is a series of webinar on which this is the third session of this series. Now about our speaker. Eder graduated from Roger Williams University School of Law, earning his Juris Doctor. He has also earned a Master of Science in Cybersecurity. He has led TransUnion's Incident Response Forensics IRF team over the last 6 years. In his leading from the front style, Eder has led the IRF team through thousands of cases ranging from unauthorized cryptocurrency mining, ransomware, business email compromises, and much more. Eder has 16 years of experience in the United States Rhode Island Army National Guard, where he led troops as a team leaders on a combat deployment in the Kandahar province in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Eder is a certified mediator and performs duties at the state headquarters level. Eder expertise includes solution or product creation, program development and expansion, threat assessment, risk mitigation, security process improvements, current capacity, helping them determining and react to the nature of their security incident breaches and determining the best course of action to recover to safe operations and meet compliance obligations. So right now, without any further delay, I am giving the mic to you, Eder.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you all for joining. First and foremost, your time is valuable and it's much appreciated. It's my pleasure to deliver another talk here at Cyber Talks for EC Council. As mentioned, this is the third episode of this 5-episode series. Please understand that you do not have to have attended the first or second sessions in order to understand what we're going to cover today. They do all, every session was designed to be beginning to end, so you can have the full experience for each session. However, because it is a series, there are connection points. So you will find that sometimes on the session, I might make a reference to something that was already covered, which will help gap and bring together for a more holistic understanding of IR for those who have attended the previous sessions. If you have not attended the previous sessions and you want to attend the previous sessions, just YouTube, EC Council, Cyber Talks, and Incident Response, and it'll come up there. You can find the videos on there as well, where they're publicly available. I look forward to doing this here today for you folks and to interacting with some of you as I had the pleasure to do so after the last session on Reddit through the page that EC Council set up for us. So it was a pleasure to be able to answer questions after the Q&A that we will do at the end of the session. So without further ado, I want to get going and get started as there's lots to cover. Again, just going to get right into it so we can cover the content that I wanted to cover you folks today. And that way we can have enough time for Q&A at the end. And then any questions that are outstanding after the Q&A session, just reach out to us through the Reddit page that EC Council made available, and I will do my best to address any questions there future post the call. Okay? So that being said, this session is all about the BEC, aka the business email compromise, or aka the BEC. BECs are the most common types of cyber incidents that we come across in our industry from a volume perspective, just the frequency of occasion. They happen a lot more often than, say, pretty much anything else, especially when it comes to comparison to ransomware or crypto mining or some other specific network intrusion. These happen at scale on a global basis. And so we see a large amount of activity being in BCs because quite often BCs are happening because of the leveraging, how threat actors leverage the human against the system. So a lot of this stuff happens because of phishing, and because of that, well, people are flawed, right? So it leads to the whole compromise happening at that level. And BCs are often then also used as the first level or the first wave of an attack that would then become something more nefarious, as perhaps a ransomware attack or something that's a bit more destructive that will actually cause substantial business interruption, which is not the most common, pain point from a BC. So we're going to cover all sorts of stuff here, from some of the threat actors' reasoning, why and how these BCs work. I already started giving you some of this information. How does folks in our industry apply common remediation? What does that look like? And what risks should you be considering? What are the common results? What happens when there's a BC? What are the common consequences? Because there's always consequences to a cyber incident, and it's important for you as the current or future responder to understand that, so we can then let those results and consequences serve as a guide. That is the ultimate conclusion of the incident, so it will become a guide for what you need to do to put yourself in the best position to have the most positive outcome at that later part. So here we go. So what is a business email compromise? So BCs, a common incident where one or more email accounts belonging to our client or organization, wherever it is that you're supporting, is impacted by the unauthorized access of an unauthorized entity, or as we would call it in our field, the threat actor. This can happen to any email platform. I've only put up logos here for the most common platforms in the commercial space, being Microsoft, 365, the Outlook app, Google Workspace, Proton Mail, I don't know, but there's tons of other email platforms out there. I'm sure you've all heard of different platforms. And yes, in the micro to SME space, which is where we do a majority of our work, you often also see smaller businesses, like I said, micros and SMEs and small medium enterprises using free versions of emails. So you will see clients also using Google Workspace or just the free Gmail, or sometimes even using Yahoo or Hotmail or one of those more quote unquote legacy email providers that you just don't see as much in the market. They are out there, and you will run into them, especially if you're operating in a defer capacity like we do, where you're taking in clients from all over the place who may bring all sorts of different scenarios and different configurations to your everyday life. Let's talk about why these happen. Why does somebody decide to do this? As always, the first and foremost, threat actors do what they do because that's their job. The same way that you and I put on clothes and go to the office or work from home and log in and whatever and do our 9 to 5 or whatever hours it is that you work, you trade your expertise for your employer to provide you funding, and because you're also passionate about what you do, hopefully. And threat actors are no different. They're human as well. The only difference is that they decided to take on a life of crime, really, to instead of a classic work scenario. So the main thing that why threat actors do what they do, well, it's financially, right? Threat actors are financially driven. So we can speculate, of course, on why anyone does anything, but the true knowledge of the mens rea, as we call it in the legal field, the intent of someone, we can really only inherently understand that through a combination of factors, right? And essentially look at it from a totality of the circumstances and what the overwhelming evidence says. But the overwhelming evidence is pretty clear. Threat actors are doing this for financial gain, and then they're doing it to gain more targets. What does that mean? Why is so much evidence? Why can I say with such confidence that that's likely why threat actors do what they do, especially when it comes to BCs? Well, uh, over 90% of the BCs that we TransUnion are exposed to, and when I talk to peers in other companies, they seem to report the same thing. But I can tell you over 90% of the BCs that we work, they result ultimately in some sort of FFT or fraudulent funds transfer. So what does that sometimes looks like? That often, more often than not, it looks like threat actor breaking into somebody's email account, achieving an understanding of what that person does for a living, having, looking at a few emails, looking at some traffic, or looking at emails in their inbox and saying, oh, okay, who can I leverage for money? So now a threat actor maybe makes a fake invoice that looks just like that victim's normal invoices, and they send that to someone who they see through an email conversation has not paid them yet. Maybe an invoice that was issued yesterday. So what are the chances that person already paid? They may not know because they don't have access to their actual account, like banking information, but it's worth the risk, right? So they will send that fake invoice and say, hey, by the way, we noticed an error on the invoice. And on top of that, we're making some banking changes, right? They'll create a narrative that's often decently believable to say, hey, disregard the last invoice, pay us used to this invoice. But now that invoice has a different bank account number, which is the threat actors. So they are actively conducting a fraud scheme that results in the victim's clients or the victim's trusted third party to render payment. And it's quite effective. We see it all the time, and it's industry agnostic. We see it from this kind of technique working in real estate. We see it working in business. We see it working in manufacturing. We see it working in professional services. You name it. It's effective, and it's also effective because you've compromised someone's email account. So it's not like a normal phishing email that someone, even with some training, may easily find because it has a different email header or the email address is wrong. It's not. It is the right email address. It is somebody that you speak with and that you may have a business relationship with who sends you invoices potentially quite frequently to pay. And if they say that there's a small change, in the process, you have to be keenly aware of that relationship to then uh, be in a better position to say, hold on, that's not normal. They've never changed payment processes on us last minute. This doesn't make sense. Let me call them and make sure that something is not wrong, or let me send another email. Let me reach out to them in another capacity. Because maybe this is a phishing situation. Maybe their email is compromised. Not many people think like that yet. Hopefully, with more education, we bring this information out there. More people will think about it like that, and then do the old school thing, which would be to pick up the phone and call that person and say, hey, did you just send me an email with a new invoice? Because that's often how we find that our clients discover the BC. Someone will call them and say, hey, you just sent me another invoice. What's going on with that? Um, or they will call that person and say, hey, you haven't paid us and it's been a couple of weeks. That's abnormal for you folks. You folks normally pay us right away. And then that person will say, what are you talking about? We paid you the day after. And then they'll have that conversation and the oh moment occurs. There's always an oh moment for the most part with most cyber incidents, but certainly with BECs where the victim realizes, okay, something is wrong, because most of the time they don't see this happening. And we'll talk about why in a little bit, but they don't realize until it's kind of too late and the funds transfer happens. So that's really the main reason we see that as the most common scenario, or a micro variation on the scenario that I just described as the most common scenario. So it's pretty obvious that threat actors are doing this to make money. Okay, and then the other reason why I mentioned it's to gain more targets. quite often a threat actor will compromise an email account, and then they will send a bunch of phishing emails, like a large volume of phishing emails, to maybe the entire client, the entire Rolodex or the entire contact records for that email account, or to select people. You never know, it could be a spear phishing situation, but they might send something with an attachment that has some sort of malicious macro or some malicious attachment involved, and hoping that the person will receive an email from a legitimate email account. Perhaps they won't have the filters to or security measures to capture potential malware attached to that email, and now they will download that to the machine, thus infecting the machine. Or sometimes it's they compromise that email account, and that's the goal. It's just to compromise more email accounts, so they can then try to conduct more fraudulent fund transfers across a larger number of targets. So that's another technique that we see. It's not uncommon for us to have a scenario where by the time the client comes to us who's been victimized by this, what made the moment is that a large number of clients started to call them and say, I'm getting a lot of odd email traffic from you. You don't normally send multiple emails on this kind of thing, or with this kind of request. Is everything okay? And then they have the moment. Or someone says, hey, you sent me a file that doesn't work. So I'm giving you a call to let you know because I emailed you back and you haven't responded. So I'm calling, letting you know the last email you sent me, or a couple of emails ago, you sent me a file that I tried to open, and it didn't work. And that's, often how that goes. And of course, then the victim has that moment. They're like, well, I didn't send you anything in the last 24 hours. And now they know something's wrong. So that kind of thing is primarily social engineering, which is the main way how BECs work. So it's a nice segue for us to talking about here, right? What I described in the previous two common scenarios are forms of phishing, right? Leveraging, again, the human against them. That's the most common way. Out of all the BECs that we see, as I mentioned, a large majority of them are phishing. About 88% of them are actually plain old phishing emails. The victim receives an email that has a header that might be, or a sender email, a sender email that looks very closely to something that normally emails them, or something that seems benign and they don't notice it. And or sometimes it's a business that interacts with the public at large. Think of, like, for example, a tax professional, like a CPA. They will often have a BEC, and what that scenario often looks like, it's someone saying, "Hey, I saw your name on Google, or I saw your business. I drove by and saw your business, banner or whatever, and I need my taxes done. So here is some of my information, so you can start helping me with my taxes." Except that, it looks like a PDF or some sort of Word document or something of that sort. And the CPA, who's now the target, thinks, okay, this is someone that is new business. So that's not uncommon for it to happen. I list my services on Google. I list my services all over the place and hoping to get more clients. So they click on it, and it pops up a page that looks like a Microsoft sign-in or something of that sort. And they think, oh, it's just somebody sharing something via SharePoint or something like that, which is, again, common in everyday business. So they put in their username and password. Well, what they didn't realize is that that's not a real Microsoft sign-on page. It's now, they were redirected to a fake page set up by the threat actor. And when they entered their credentials, it wasn't to actually sign into Microsoft. They literally just gave their username and password to the threat actor, and now the threat actor just logs in. Some of you may be thinking, well, maybe they should have multi-factor authentication, and then that might stop that. And if you are thinking that, kudos to you. You're correct. More often than not, multi-factor authentication will stop the threat actor from gaining access under this specific scheme. Now, MFA can be bypassed. It's becoming a bigger threat, and more often we're seeing weaker forms of multi-factor authentication, or MFA for short, being bypassed. which is why we recommend strong forms of multi-factor authentication, specifically phish-resistant multi-factor authentication. I'm not going to go deep into that, as that is obviously another topic that we could spend a lot of time on. But it's often just a lack of cyber hygiene or security measures like MFA that can stop some of these BECs. But you would be surprised how many, especially in the micro to SME space, clients don't have that level of security. More often than not, they have it after the BC because hindsight's 2020. But this is the most common way, and I speak about this, and when I say that it's common, it's global too. We have clients in Australia, clients in Germany, clients in Sweden, Canada, US, UK, LATAM, you name it, and they all come to us with BCs, and the scenario most of the time is the one I just described to you. So that's why I'm spending so much time on this scenario, because I want you to have a more granular understanding of what the scenario looks like, because ideally it'll help you say, oh, we might have a BC, or hey, client, you may have a BC because the story is starting to sound familiar. So I'm giving you the full context here because it's going to be, for sure, the most common format that you will experience BCs. Second to phishing, brute force is fairly common, meaning that the threat actor uses some sort of technology to guess correctly or break the password for the account. Credential stuffing is another pretty common one, right? Folks, again, lack of cyber hygiene is a big thing here. So folks will use the same password for their email address in other the login credentials or other applications. Not uncommon, unfortunately, for people to say use the same email, their email password for their Microsoft Outlook 365 account on, say, LinkedIn. Then LinkedIn may have a compromise, and in that compromise, users' username and passwords get leaked. So now that password's out there. So now it's a matter of time until the threat actor says, well, their username is their email address. Here's a password. Let me see if I can, use this. Maybe it's the same. And quite often they're right. And then they just log in. So that's another common way, and we see that in the evidence. We'll see that in the email logs when available. We'll see just a flat out sign in. And through the investigation, we will find zero evidence of any phishing emails or any other indicators of compromise that will show social engineering. And then at the same time, we'll do threat intelligence and see that that person's username and email, username and password were leaked in some other incident. And sometimes we get full confirmation because we will interrogate the victim, and interrogate's a strong word. I just mean really ask questions nicely, right, of the victim, our client, and say, hey, can you check with that employee? And it's no harm, let's make sure that we're being kind to people, because folks make mistakes. Folks make mistakes all the time. Let's see if they're using the same password. And you would be surprised how often the answer is yes. And now you've pieced it all together and you have a successful credential stuffing attack. And of course, it can happen via an insider threat. People may share with each other their credentials for whatever reason. People may be using shared accounts. People often, especially in the office, I've seen this many times when I wasn't a remote employee, where people will have stickies or some sort of notes with their usernames and passwords because they don't use a password manager or some kind of digital tool to secure their emails. Their credentials and passwords. So they have it written down at their desk, and people will walk by and see it. And if that person is looking to leverage that information in a malicious way, then you have an insider threat leading to a BEC. Again, most of these techniques, which are the most common ones by far, their root cause is a lack of cyber hygiene and a lack of proper security measures. So BECs can be stopped. They can be not always 100%. Sure, I wouldn't say they can be 100% stopped, because things are going to happen. Some threat actors are pretty sophisticated, but you can drastically decrease your BEC risk for any organization if you apply strong cyber hygiene practices and proper and strong security. What does common remediation look like? Because you should be aware of that, right? So you have a BC. How do you fix a BC? Luckily, a BC is often a lot easier and faster to quote unquote fix or put the fire out than, say, a ransomware event or something of that sort. That's a bit more destructive to the overall network. Nowadays, especially in the micro to small, medium enterprise space, the micro SME space, most folks nowadays are really running cloud-based email accounts. More and more often, we see our clients have either Microsoft 365, it's all cloud, varying levels of licenses, that's for sure, and configurations of their 365 or Azure Active Directory IDE 365 environments. But more often than not, that's what we're seeing. It's cloud email. Again, vast majority in the commercial space is Microsoft 365, followed by Google Workspace. And regardless of either, the remediation steps for a cloud email account are pretty standard. First and foremost, you have to reset the password on the account, which most of the time will then also include, and should always include, I should say most of the time, it should always include before sign out of all devices. So you want to make sure that you are pushing out, you are logging out every single device that is connected to that account, and then you're changing that password. So that way you are effectively pushing out the threat actor. There are some exceptions to that. Okay, there are some programs that some threat actors are now leveraging that become an add-on app to that account, which might allow them some at least temporary access after the sign out and password reset. There are also, if the client is using a hybrid environment where they may still have some resemblance of a on-premise exchange to host their email, where things could get, threat actors could compromise the email environment on both ends. That might allow them to achieve a better method of persistence. Okay, but for the most part, I would say the vast majority of your cloud hosted BCs will be remediated by doing a forced sign out and resetting passwords. The other thing that has to happen, which often is ignored, especially by those who are not forensically trained or don't have proper incident response training. There's a lot of just IT providers who work in more of a just fix, something that broke, right? And so they're not investigative in nature, and looking at certain things often is outside of their purview. So that's where the third bullet there about mailbox rules come into place. I made a specific mention of mailbox rules because it is one of the most clear indications of a business email compromise. Mailbox rules are rules that you can, if you're not aware of what they are, the short story of it here is that it's a feature within email environments that allows the user to create a rule that somewhat acts like a filter. So this rule can say something like, every email that comes from EC Council is marked red and put in this folder that you maybe call EC Council. Now, when EC Council sends you an email, it gets, the rule reads that email before it even hits your inbox, and it would then mark the email as read and put it in that folder, which effectively means you wouldn't even get a notification that that email is received, and you wouldn't see it on your inbox. Threat actors do that all the time. It is the number one way how they hijack conversations. They will target someone that they want to, fish, especially when they're aiming at achieving an FFT. They'll say any email coming from this person or any email with this keyword, mark it as read, move it to this folder, and then the user never sees it. So looking for mailbox rules is critical because you also have to delete those rules to make sure that the rule's not giving the threat actor access to emails. Because even if you sign out the all devices and you do a password reset and you effectively pushed the threat actor out of the mailbox from its active access they had upon compromise, if say the threat actor made a really broad rule that says, any emails with specific keywords get marked as read and then sent to say the RSS folder, now they configure the RSS feed on the email account to auto forward emails to them. And if you don't remove that rule and you don't stop that RSS feed, they are still going to get a bunch of emails from that account. So it's critical that some investigation, even at the IT level, ideally, is done when you're dealing with a BEC, so you can truly stop the bleeding. Right? That's the biggest considerations you have to have here when it comes to remediation. And of course, always, I didn't put a bullet on here, but always remember about evidence preservation. If you are going to have an investigation, whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're going to recommend that for your client, make sure that they understand that they shouldn't be deleting the mailbox. They shouldn't be deleting really any emails, at least not from the delete folder or anywhere that will put it in a longer term archive or really destroy that email, because it may be important during the investigation to have that email, even if it's a phishing email, for analysis, so we can analyze malware that may be in that email or analyze metadata on that email. All that stuff is going to come into play. Like I said, less and less often you're going to see on-premise email exchanges. Larger organizations, of course, often are still running on-premise exchanges because it's very costly and time-consuming to take a large org from on-prem to cloud, even though most of them are making that move. With on-premise, we're now talking about actually having an exchange server running your email. So as you can see, remediation is going to be a bit more detailed and it's going to require a lot more work. Yes, you still have to do a password reset for that individual user or for however many accounts you deem to have been compromised. You still have to sign out the devices attached to that account. But now you also have to be concerned about the server itself. Is there now some sort of malicious code? Is there some proxy shell or something or some sort of web shell that's running on that server? That's a cheat. That's how the threat actor has persistence. So that's where endpoint detection response and EDR, XDR, NDR tools are going to come into play in helping you find risks within the exchange. Now you also have to look at server-wide policies or tenant-wide policies that may have been applied by the threat actor, which really only come into play in a cloud-hosted email if the account compromised was an admin account. And then you have unique things like network traffic that might indicate the presence of a threat actor. PowerShell code that may be running that shouldn't be running on that server, which may indicate that that's the work of a threat actor. Randomized tasks that are telling the server to do certain things or call out to the threat actor every so often, things like that just simply do not apply in cloud hosted are going to be things you're going to have to consider when it comes to on-premise securing or remediating an on-premise exchange. Okay. The considerations, I'm going to go through this a little quick just because we've already talked about some of the building blocks here, and I'll make some callbacks to our previous sessions because they tie in. With any cyber incident, you always have to take into account that there might be privacy impacts. That's going to primarily be driven by the kind of data that you host. In previous sessions, we've talked about personally identifiable information or personal information, aka PI or PII. That's often going to be the building blocks and understanding of privacy risk is going to be, of course, understanding what data you host. Nonetheless, ECs, more often than not, result in a privacy in a privacy incident or what would be called an actual breach, because many businesses transact via email with information that would fit within that category. Perhaps you're in a professional services situation where your clientele does not provide you personal identifiable information, or PII for short. Great. If that's the case, certainly lowers your privacy risk or any privacy impact to come out of the incident, but you may be transacting in HR data. And so now your employees' information may potentially be now compromised, which has its impacts, okay? And that may result in having to deal with regulatory ramifications, whether that's notification duties, whether that's notification to government entities, law enforcement, privacy commissions, depending where you are in the world, all sorts of different implications that comes there, okay? But BCs are notorious for creating an escalation in the overall incident response cycle from a time perspective and also from a cost perspective when the victim deals with PII. Again, fraudulent funds transactions and transfers, as we've talked about, that's the main focus of the BEC threat actor for the most part. What happens when that money is lost? Are you going to have to reimburse the client or your vendor or whoever was fished into that fraudulent transaction? Because they might be coming to you expecting you to indemnify them for the money that they lost because it was your email account that was compromised. That can also lead to legal action against you. So all these things are considerations that as a business, you should understand they may come from a BEC. And so it's really important to try to protect your business and harden your security to avoid BECs, because once the BEC happens, these considerations may now be impacts you have to deal with. And that can be very detrimental to a business, especially again in the micro and SME space where funds are available, where perhaps they don't have as much insurance backing and just more limited resources, right? It's a lot easier if, Microsoft or, Coca-Cola has a BEC and a vendor says, hey, we're out $10,000 because of this fraudulent funds transfer. It's a lot easier for Coca-Cola to write a $10,000 check than it is for a 5-person, small business. That's just an obvious, right? So these are things that you have to think as a responder if you're going to be really effective and if you're going to provide lots of value to your clients, okay? Of course, again, phishing campaigns, right? You need to be cognizant that you might have a BEC that may go unnoticed for months. It's not uncommon for us to see that, especially when FFTs are not the goal, because FFTs tend to get caught a little quicker because money is being transacted. So somebody usually ends up calling somebody and saying, hey, why haven't you delivered goods? Well, I haven't received payment from you. Or, hey, why haven't you paid us? Well, I did pay you. All those sorts of scenarios. But when you're just sending when the threat actor just starts phishing people, and they're not doing it in mass, where most filters are not going to catch it. Microsoft, most of the time, if you send out more than 1,000 emails at once, or it'll alert somebody, your admin, or it might even block your account, depending on configuration, because you sent out too many emails, and the email, Microsoft itself is trying to protect you and say, okay, this is not normal. So we're going to block the account. But if you're phishing one person, 5 people, 10 people at a time, you may go completely unnoticed. And it's not uncommon for us to see a BC. And when we look at the logs, the threat actor made contact many, many months. That's when they first made an impact to the account many months prior to the identification or discovery of the actual BC. Business interruption, not very common with BEC, but it can. A lot of businesses nowadays, their entire client communication happens via email, or a lot of the delivery of their services happens via email. Perhaps clients are uploading data to you, and then you're doing something and then uploading data back to the client. If you don't have email, if your email's down for any period of time, you may have some business interruption issues that you may have to deal with. So that can happen with BECs. It's just not as often as you see it happen with other types of cyber incidents, such as ransomware, where there's almost always a business interruption component. Remediation efforts, are considerations, right? Do you have the skill sets in house to remediate an email account successfully, or an email tenant if the entire email environment has been compromised? It's what we call an email tenant. Do you have to bring someone else, external support? What skills does your external support bring? Perhaps as most micro and SMEs in the space, you have another micro to SME IT support who does most of your IT or InfoSec work. Does that entity know how to properly remediate a BC? Do they know that they need to preserve certain evidence? Do they know that there might be privacy implications? Or this is often where cyber insurance comes into place, or some sort of cyber product built on, bolt on to your GL, your general liability insurance. Sorry for the acronyms. But that's where some of this stuff comes into play. It's the ability to get experts at a very quick response time to assist you when you have a cyber incident. Because quite often, by the time we get to a client, to a victim, it has been several days or weeks sometimes since the BC happened. And we find that when we intake these clients, all that has been done was the password change, not always even a forced sign out. That's it. There are still mailbox rules in place. If the forced sign out was not done, quite often the threat actor regains access to the mailbox because they were active in there, or they still had a session cookie that allowed them to still remain in the mailbox. So then they themselves push the password change. But before pushing a new password change, they put in a mailbox rule. So that way the victim doesn't see that they did a password change and they don't sign out devices. So everyone just stays in. These are things that happen. So you need to make sure that you're bringing in the right skill sets to properly remediate your account, so you don't continue having a BC, which can be very destructive to a business. Not only because of the operational issues it creates, but because of also just like optics, marketing, right? Loss of trust with clients, all sorts of stuff here. So, these are some of the results, right? We've talked a little bit about this. If you have personal information or PII in your mailboxes, you should look to get rid of that, ideally. And ideally, you should really look to never have that in the mailbox, and you should look to get that information from your clientele via a more secured method. But because if you do have a personally identifiable information, your API in your mailbox, and you have a BC, more likely than not, there's a good chance, because of the inherent nature of the access the threat actor is going to have to some of those emails, that you may likely would end up in a breach notification scenario where you're now having to potentially undergo data mining and menu review, which is a whole process of identifying what emails, what attachments contain PII, then identifying whose PII is in there, so you can then form a list of the people you have to notify. All of this can become incredibly costly. It can also take many, many weeks to go from beginning to end with those two phases. And this can really have an impact financial on the business. And it's often how we see a simple, what would be a simple single account business email compromise below, go above the limits on people's insurance because of the times high number of PII they may have and the results of data mining, review, and notification. And then that notification may also result, again, having to notify government entities, and that can be burdensome for all sorts of reasons. Right? And then obviously we talked about FFTs already, so financial loss is a common result, a common consequence in BECs, and that can also result from legal action against you by someone who was part of the FFT victim, who may be looking for indemnity, aka to have you pay them back the money lost. Again, rebuilding trust, right? If clients or business partners receive emails that legitimately came from one of your email accounts and that led to an FFT, it often results in that business partner having some hesitancy in trusting to keep doing business with you via email. So you always have to regain that trust. And that can sometimes be really difficult, especially depending on your industry and who your partners are. Again, claim payout. This is more in the insurance place, right? We CBCs often be so costly that they do go above insurance limits, and that results in additional out-of-pocket expenses for businesses. And we've talked about reporting and all of that stuff. Okay, and then what I meant by unexpected long-term costs due to remediation may be the upgrades that you may have to do. Right? Most businesses, again, I mentioned this earlier today, hindsight is 2020. I know it's an old saying, but it's so applicable. Um, we often see victims have a BEC and now they want to enable MFA. They may not have the proper licensing to enable certain types of MFA. So now they have to up the licensing level they have with their email provider. That now means they're paying more money per license. So now there's long-term cost there because now you will forever be paying more money per license. We've even seen some commercial entities who have email that's by other third-party providers who don't actually even offer security features such as MFA. That is still a thing. There are a bunch of email providers out there who don't offer something like MFA or email. So now you may be looking to move your business away from that provider to a new provider. And that has all sorts of costs because not only are you getting a new license, you might have a month or two where you're paying for double licenses because you have to transfer mailbox contents and things of that sort to minimize the impact in that transition from one email to the other, or you're doing email on premise and now you're bringing on cloud. There's all sorts of other costs there that might be not one-time fees, or it may be something that you're spending money on for many months. And again, that's an unexpected long-term cost that your business probably did not have planned for that year in its budget. That's it. Those are the ins and outs of BCs. There's a lot more and a lot more nuance that we could talk about this. It's a 1 hour webinar that I could easily make another 3 hours of to really get into the weeds of the business email compromise. But this is what you need to know if you're going to start working BCs. This information, you should have a much more nuanced understanding of how the stuff works, how these incidents happen, and hopefully you took enough information from this. And I know that a lot of my sessions are very information dense. It's for a reason. I want to give you as much value as possible. I want to help you be the best responder possible. I want you to be able to now go to your job or go into a new place and say, I know certain things that will happen when a BC happen. I know what to look out for, and you can bring so much value to your business and to your client. This information. So I hope it was helpful to you. And there's 10 minutes left. Let's get the Q&A going. And thank you for your time again. It's much, much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Cheddar. It was a wonderful session, and we are actually very much grateful that this is a series of webinar where we can discuss more and more on the topic. So now before the Q&A, we would like to announce that EC Council, this particular webinar is in sync with EC Council ECIH certification. Anyone with an ECIH certification is eligible for 17,000 plus jobs on LinkedIn globally with an average salary of $75,000 per annum. If you are interested to know more, kindly take part in the poll which is going to be conducted right now. Let us know your preferred mode of training and we will reach out to you. So, Eder, should we start the Q&A?
Oh.
Yeah. So, our first question is, what are the common lessons learned from the past BEC incidents?
Common lessons. You should read every sender's email address before you actually click on any links that they sent you in the body of the email or try to open any attachments. Quite often, that will be the first thing in stopping a BC from happening. Second of all, pay attention to context. Is this an email you're receiving from someone who you interact with? And and if so, is it out of the normal? And if it is, be a little skeptical and think about it before you go clicking on things or downloading things. And don't be afraid to, again, do the old school thing. Pick up the phone and give them a call and ask, hey, did you send this email? That might save you a lot of headache. And third of all, I understand for some people, they feel like security features such as hyper complex passwords, having to type in 15 different characters, 16, 20, 30 characters into something to sign in, or trying to remember complex passwords, or having to deal with an OTP push for multi-factor authentication are burdens. These are burdens that are well worth the burden for the security they provide. Uh, I understand that it can be a little annoying, but you need to put the security measures in place. Everyone is human. We all are, and everyone can fall for a phishing simulation or for a phishing event, no matter who, even me. I have fallen for it in the past. Okay? I'm not infallible. Granted, it was a simulation done by our company, thankfully. But hey, the end of an 18-hour workday, at clocking in at 1 o'clock in the morning, you've been working since 6 a.m. With very little breaks, because that's the kind of day you're having, you might not be paying attention. And then that's when things go south. So those are the three main considerations, or lessons I'll leave you with. Next question.
Thank you so much, Edward. We will take last two questions. Our second last question is: no password is immune to brute force attacks. So how do we stop it?
Sorry, can you repeat the part, susceptible to brute force attacks?
Yes, no password is immune to brute force attacks. So how do you stop it?
Yes. No password is immune to brute force. It's a factually correct statement. However, a really good hyper complex password would take, without massive compute power, a long time to brute force. Um, so that can already, just in itself, make a large percentage of threat actors give up because they will not have the tooling or the compute to crack a password that's strong. But most importantly, this is where multi-factor authentication comes into place. Your password gets broken, you still have to overcome the multi-factor authentication. And if you have strong form of multi-factor authentication, that's going to be incredibly difficult. And it might require, especially if you're actively and successfully deployed really good phish-resistant multi-factor authentication, it would require the most sophisticated threat actors, nation-state level stuff, to really break into your environment. So it's a really strong tool. So the main thing is the MFA. Even if it's not phish resistant, it's better than nothing, and it's certainly a lot better than nothing. And it's better than even a complex password, even if it's a weaker form of MFA, such as SMS or OTP.
Thank you, Edward. We are going to take our last question. After a BEC incident, how should organizations conduct a post-incident analysis to prevent future occurrences? And what key factors should be included in the review?
All right, that's a great question. I talk about after action reviews, as I often call them, because it's a military term. Um, every org should be doing one after any cyber incident. So all your decision makers, your key decision makers, should all be at that table. Somebody from finance, your CFO, or whoever does your finances. Your COO. Again, if you're large enough to have those C titles. Um, Presidents, CEOs of the company, things of that sort. Of course, as the larger and larger the organization, you're not going to see C-level members dealing with this. But if you have a robust InfoSec department, then it'll likely be, unless it requires big costs, like those long-term costs that I talked about, like we're having these kinds of issues too often and we need to migrate. then you're going to bring in those people. But if it's more of a smaller one-off scenario, then it'll probably live and die within that InfoSec department. But in a micro to SME, you need to have all the decision makers there to talk about it. And you need to talk about, okay, well, what happened? Decent amounts of detail. How did it happen? What were the implications? Like what happened? Like what were the consequences of the incident? How did we fix it? And how can we do it better? And what can we do to prevent it from happening? Right? And especially in the BC, like I said in the very beginning of this episode, it's one of the most preventable types of cyber incidents. Yet it's the most common, and it's because people often are complacent after they've put the fire out. It's not uncommon for us to have repeat BC clients. It really is not uncommon. And so it's not uncommon that we see someone have a BC, then they do the remediation, we get involved, sometimes, usually quite often post remediation because it's quicker, cloud-based emails, as we talked about, do an investigation, and say that even when they have PII, we do the data mining, we do the review, we do the notification, we take them through that entire process. Then 6 months later, they come back because someone else's in the environment email account was compromised. And it's the same scenario. And it finds out that even though we recommended, hey, you need to enable multi-factor authentication. You should be doing this. You should be enacting a password policy that demands hyper-complex passwords. You should be, putting password managers tools available, making those available to your employees, so they are not using the same password across multiple environments, pieces of the environment. So they are using hyper-complex passwords, and you're not expecting humans to remember 10 different hyper-complex passwords. And yet the client did none of those things. And then the incident happens again. So these are things that happen all the time. And I think that addresses the question, right? Like bring the decision makers into the table, explain to them that this will keep happening. These damages will keep occurring if you don't take action. Explain to them what the proper actions should be, what proper cyber hygiene looks like, what common tools are out there, what costs. As the responder, especially if you're in-house and you are in a position to have a lot of those longer term conversations, come to the table ready. Right? Do your due diligence. Go price it out. If you say, hey, we had E1 licenses for our email environment, and because of that, we were not able to get very detailed information for our investigation. And that led to perhaps more notification than we wanted to, and that led to questions being unanswered because evidence simply was not available. We need to move everyone up to this licensing level. Well, we have this many email accounts at this level. This is what's going to cost. But these are the benefits we get, right? And so bring that information to the table, so you can present it to the business leaders, and then that way they can make decisions because you're now here, you're presenting things to them that are more in their wheelhouse, and you're speaking a little bit more of their language, and you can work together to achieve better security, which is the outcome that everyone wants. But you have to collaborate. Leave it there.
Well, thank you so much, Eder, for answering the questions. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking forward for more and more sessions as we want to give the information to our audience. We have more two seasons of this particular series. Eder, we cannot see you. Uh,
Oh, I don't know what happened there. There I am. Yes,
yeah.
happy to talk about it briefly, folks. Thank you again for joining us this session. Thank you if you joined us for all sessions. We will be doing 2 more sessions in the series. They happen at the same time, third Thursday third Thursday of every month. So next month we will be covering IR plans and testing essentials. So we're going to talk about the incident response plan in much better detail. We mentioned them in session 1. We've mentioned them a little bit in session 2. I didn't really mention much of it here. There wasn't enough time. but it is important that the C scenarios are covered in your IR plan. We will talk about that next session. We'll talk about testing, talking about, so that's penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about them, not just what they are, but we're going to talk about when you should be doing this kind of testing, why you should be doing this kind of testing, that kind of information. And then our final session will wrap with data mining and managed review, which we talked about in this session in a little bit more detail than we've talked about in the past. And I wanted to make a session dedicated to that because it's a specific service that happens very often in the digital forensics incident response space. It's something that as a responder, you should have a decent understanding of it, even if your company doesn't provide that sort of service, because more likely than not, you will be exposed to that sort of service, and you should know what to expect from that process because it is unique in comparison to the rest of the stuff that we've talked about. And again, it can be incredibly costly. So it's something that you should, understand a bit so you can talk to your business partners on. So that's what's coming up in the next couple of months. I hope that you will all be there for us to have more discussions on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eder, for giving the message to our audience.